Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory. October 1883. The kind of town where the piano stops when the wrong man walks in. Rose Calloway had been behind that bar for 16 months. 16 months of keeping the lamp lit, her books balanced, and her chin level. 16 months of watching her husband's photograph on the back wall and saying nothing to no one about what she actually believed had happened the night his horse came home from Crooked Creek alone. She knew Prescott was coming before the door opened. She always did. Sheriff Wade Prescott moved through the room like a man who had never once needed to ask for space because he never had. He stopped at the bar, reached across, closed his hand around her wrist. Not grabbing, not squeezing, just resting it there, the way a man rests his hand on something he's already decided belongs to him. 6 people in the room. Not one of them stood up. Then a chair scraped back from the corner table. Nobody had noticed the stranger sitting there. He crossed the room without hurrying, stopped 4 feet from Prescott, and said it flat and quiet, like a man reading a fact off a page. "The lady didn't give you permission to touch her." Prescott nodded to his deputy near the door. Colton's hand dropped to his revolver. He never got it clear of the holster. The stranger's hand was already there, locked around Colton's wrist. Iron still. The draw stopped dead. He hadn't seemed to move. He was just suddenly there, the way a trap is suddenly there. And his eyes never left Prescott's face the entire time. A vein moved in Prescott's jaw. Just once. The stranger held it one more second. Then let go. Stepped back. Folded his hands at his sides like a man waiting at a counter. Prescott adjusted his coat. Touched his hat brim. "Friday, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Think on it." He walked out. The spurs faded down the boardwalk. Rose came to the stranger's table with a fresh bottle. Looked at him the way she might look at a deed before signing. "You just made trouble for yourself." "No, why?" He looked at his glass. The whiskey held the lamplight and didn't let it go. Because nobody else did. His name was Cole Hardin. She would learn that before morning. She would learn other things too about a journal hidden upstairs, about a fraud running for years behind the face of the law, and about what really happened to her husband out at Crooked Creek. But that part of the story starts now.
The sun went down behind the Sandia Mountains and bled red across the rooftops of Dusty Creek. Cole Hardin rode in from the east at a walking pace. No hurry, no announcement. He was smoke drifting into a room slow. Quiet, already there before anyone noticed. Nobody looked up when he came off the main road. That was the first thing he read about this town. And he read it the same way he'd read every town for 4 years, carefully. The way you read ground you might need to run across in the dark. He walked his horse the full length of Main Street before stabling her. Not sightseeing, measuring. Shops closed before 5. People on the boardwalk kept their eyes down. A woman across the street pulled her daughter off the planks the moment a man with a lawman's stride rounded the far corner. Pulled her like reflex, like she'd done it before without thinking. Cole had seen towns like this. He'd helped make one, once. The memory sat low in his chest where old injuries sit. Not pain exactly, just presence. The Sylvester Saloon was the biggest building on the street. Lamplight spilled warm through the front windows. He could hear piano from half a block away clean, unhurried playing. A man filling silence rather than breaking it. He pushed through the door and took the room in one pass. Corner table, left side, back to the wall. Clear line to both exits. Old habit. He wasn't proud of it, but he sat there anyway. The piano player was an older man, 60 or so, missing 2 fingers on his left hand and working around it like he'd been working around it his whole life. The place was maybe two-thirds full. The noise level was wrong for the crowd size. Too quiet. People talking like they were being careful about it. A woman appeared at his elbow. Not a waitress's walk, an owner's walk. She carried herself through the room the way you carry yourself through something that belongs to you without performance, without asking permission. She set a whiskey glass on his table, looked at him, waited. He nodded. She poured, left without a word. He watched her go. Behind the bar, on the back wall, was a photograph, a man and a woman. The man had his arm around her, and she was smiling, really smiling. Not the managed expression she wore right now. Cole looked at the photograph for a while, then looked back at the bar. The woman behind it, Rose Calloway. He'd learned the name before morning was watching the door, not waiting for someone, watching the way people watch for something they know is coming. The shift happened before the door opened. Collective stillness, a tightening. The piano player hit a wrong note, just one. Just for a second, then found his way back. Sheriff Wade Prescott walked in, 6'2", broad through the chest, a face that had probably been decent once before whatever lived behind it finished its work. He moved through the room like a man who had never once needed to ask for space. His badge caught the lamplight. He didn't look at anyone except the woman behind the bar. He crossed the room without stopping. His boots were loud against the floor. Rose didn't move, both hands flat on the bar, her chin level. Mrs. Calloway, his voice was pleasant, genuinely pleasant. That was the part that made Cole's jaw tighten. I was hoping we could revisit our conversation. My answer hasn't changed. Sheriff Prescott reached across the bar and closed his hand around her wrist. Not grabbing, not squeezing, just resting it there, casual and easy, the way a man rests his hand on something he considers his. Rose looked down at his hand, then up at his face. She did not pull away. She didn't flinch. She held herself together with the particular stillness of a woman who had been holding herself together for a long time and was very good at it. Nobody in the room moved. Not the ranchers at the back table. Not the couple near the window. Not the piano player who had gone back to his song and was looking at his keys. 6 people. Not one of them stood up. Cole set his glass down and stood up. He didn't rush it, didn't make a show. He just stopped sitting and started walking, the way a door stops being closed and is open. He stopped 4 feet from Prescott. The lady didn't give you permission to touch her. The room went completely still. Prescott turned. He took his time looking Cole over the particular look of a man who is used to being the most dangerous thing anywhere and is deciding whether that's still true. Something moved behind his eyes, a small recalculation. This is a private business matter, Prescott said, still pleasant. Move along. Private business doesn't put marks on people, Cole said. A beat of silence, long and specific. Prescott looked around the room, making sure they were watching. Men like him always needed witnesses not to the violence, to the part where everyone understood who was in charge. Then he released Rose's wrist, adjusted his coat, and looked at Cole one more time. Something in Cole's stillness gave him pause. Not a threat exactly, more like the memory of violence. The residue of a man who had been in too many rooms like this one and had never once been the one who walked out worse. Prescott touched his hat brim. Friday, Mrs. Calloway. Think on it. He left the spurs faded down the boardwalk. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the piano player set his hands back on the keys. He looked up at Cole as Cole passed on the way back to his table. For a moment. First time in 2 years, somebody said that in this room, Silas Dunn said quietly. Doesn't matter what comes next. That mattered. Rose came to his table with a fresh bottle. She stood across from him and looked at him the way she might look at a deed before signing it. Carefully, not hostile, just thorough. You just made trouble for yourself, she said. I know why. He looked at his glass. The whiskey caught the lamplight and held it, because nobody else did, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation required. Something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet. Something closer to the beginning of consideration. Room 3, floor, she said. Breakfast starts at 6. She walked back to the bar. Cole sat at the window table for another hour. He watched the dark street. He thought about the photograph on the wall, the woman who used to smile differently. He thought about a man named Frank Calloway, who no longer appeared in any photograph at all. Outside or open somewhere in the dark, then closed. Nobody checked to see why. Pre-dawn in the high desert has its own kind of cold. Not the wet cold of somewhere green. Dry cold. The kind that finds the gaps between your buttons and settles there. It smells like iron and juniper and open space that doesn't particularly need you in it. Cole was already outside. Old habit. He walked a perimeter before a town woke up. Read what daylight would cover over. He'd been doing it since the war, and the war had been a long time ago. And the habit had outlasted everything else from those years. He wasn't sure what that said about him. Nothing good, probably. Main Street was empty, except for a dog sleeping in front of the assay office. Cole walked the length of it once, slow hands in his coat pockets, watching the way the buildings sat in relation to each other. Then he stopped. 3 buildings. Same block, 50 steps between each. The sheriff's office. The county courthouse Judge Fitch's name on the placard beside the door. And the county land records office. He stood at the corner for a while, measuring it. A man who controls the law. A man who enforces the law. And the same 2 men controlling every document that defines what belongs to who. He knew this design. He'd worked inside one once. Not the same town. Not the same names. But the same triangle, the same 3 points of a structure, built to look like government from the outside and function like a private operation from within. The nausea of recognition was something he'd learned to sit with. It didn't go away. You just got better at breathing through it. Amma had breakfast going when he came in through the back door at 6. She moved through the Silver Star kitchen the way water moves through a place it knows well, not fast, not slow, completely certain. She didn't look up when Cole came in. Just reached for another cup without being asked and set it on the counter near the coffee pot. He poured his own and sat at the small table by the window. Tommy Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, hat in hand, a little out of breath. He was 16 and built like someone who had been doing physical work since he could walk. Dark eyes, careful face. He looked at Cole, then at Amma. Horses fed and watered, Tommy said. Brushed her down, too. She had some trail dust on her left flank. Cole looked at the boy. Thank you, Tommy. Tommy stopped. It was a small stop. Half a second, maybe less. But Cole caught at the pause of someone who wasn't accustomed to being addressed by name, with nothing else attached. No instruction, no correction, just his name and a thank you. Then Tommy nodded and was gone. Amma set a plate in front of Cole. She didn't say anything right away. Cole ate. The eggs were good. The coffee was better than anything he'd had in 4 years of diner counters and campfires. After a while, Amma said, without looking at him, "That boy has worked this livery since he was 12. In 4 years. You are the second person I have heard thank him." Cole looked up. Who was the first? Frank Calloway. He held that for a moment. I didn't know that mattered so much. Just saying thank you. Amma turned from the stove. She looked at him directly, not unkindly, but without softening it either. When a person has been made invisible by a whole town, somebody seeing them, really seeing them, using their name, treating them like a person instead of a piece of furniture that is not a small thing. She paused. You just made that boy a person this morning. Most people in this town haven't bothered in 4 years. Don't tell me that doesn't matter. Cole didn't tell her that. He finished his breakfast and thought about it instead. Silas Dunn had been setting up the bar since before Cole arrived, polishing glasses with the mechanical patience of a man whose hands knew the work so well his mind could go somewhere else entirely while they did it. Cole sat on a stool and watched him for a moment. Then tell me about Frank Calloway. Silas's hands slowed, not stopped, slowed the careful measurement of a man choosing his portion. Frank Calloway, he said, was a good man. He picked up a fresh glass, honest, worked hard, loved his wife in the plain, unglamorous way that decent men love when they don't have the words for anything more complicated. And that was enough, more than enough. And Grady Cole started. Prescott, Silas corrected quietly. Sheriff Wade Prescott and Judge Harlan Fitch. First cousins. Been connected to every land transaction in this valley for 6 years. He set the glass down. Frank's 80 acres out, past Crooked Creek, sits on top of the only reliable water source on the southern approach of this valley. You control that water. You control everything that needs it: livestock, crops, people. Prescott made Frank 4 offers over 2 years. Frank said no 4 times, politely, without any room for misunderstanding. A pause. 3 weeks after the 4th no riding accident, out at Crooked Creek. His horse came back without him. Cole was quiet. Buck Malone ran the inquest. Silas continued. Prescott's deputy at the time ruled it accidental inside 48 hours. Buck transferred to another county. 1 month later, he looked at the bar, and Prescott started making offers to Rose. How many? 4. Same as Frank. She said no 4 times. He looked up. You were here for the conversation about a 5th. Cole absorbed that. Then, the law here, it's not protecting anyone it should be protecting. Silas set down the glass he was holding. The law here is being used wrong, and you want to know something. A law being used wrong is more dangerous than no law at all, because no law. People know to protect themselves. A law used wrong, it wears the uniform of justice, while it does the exact opposite of justice. People don't see it coming the same way. He looked at Cole steadily. Frank saw it coming. Didn't save him. Cole found Rose in the back room going over supply ledgers. She didn't hear him right away. He watched her for a moment, the focused, precise way she moved through numbers on a page, the way her finger tracked each line without making a mark. This was a woman who understood that being right mattered more than being fast. She looked up, didn't seem surprised to see him. That photograph on the wall, Cole said. Behind the bar, Frank. I know. He leaned against the doorframe. How did he really die? Rose set her pen down. She looked at him with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether a question deserves a real answer. Then writing accident. That's what the report says. What do you say? The pause was short, but it was real. Frank had ridden that creek bottom for 4 years. He knew every rock, every soft bank, every place where the water cut under the edge. She looked at the window. He would not have fallen. Silence. Nobody's ever asked me that, she said, directly. Like they actually wanted to know the answer. I want to know the answer, Cole said. Something moved through her expression. Not relief, exactly. Something rarer. The look of a person who has been saying a true thing for a long time to people who nodded politely and moved on and has just been believed. She looked away quickly. More coffee, please, he said. It was mid-afternoon when Cole came around the side of the livery stable and heard it. A man's boot heel, dragging deliberately through dirt. Then a voice flat, contemptuous, not even angry. Just casual the way cruelty gets when it's practiced enough. Half-breed teaching reading. Most useless waste of dirt I ever saw. Cole came around the corner. One of Prescott's hired hands was walking away already, not looking back. The kind of man who says things and keeps moving because he doesn't think he needs to see the result. In the dirt behind the stable, Tommy Wren was crouched down. In front of him, a boy of maybe 8 was crying quietly, his hands in his lap. Between them, the letters they'd been making in the dirt were erased. A boot heel, dragged straight through the middle of the whole lesson. Tommy picked up the stick he'd been using. He started again. First letter, patient and quiet, like nothing had happened. The young boy watched through his tears. Cole crossed the yard. He sat down on the ground next to both of them. Just sat down in the dirt. The way you sit next to someone when you want them to know you're not going anywhere. He looked at the letters Tommy was drawing. What lesson are you on? Tommy looked at him. The surprise was brief and well-controlled. Sounds, he said. We're working on sounds that don't look like they should. Cole nodded. Then he looked directly at Tommy. Not past him, at him. Nobody, not that man. Not anyone else in this town has the right to tell you that learning isn't for you. That's not a privilege somebody gives you or takes away. You were born with that right, same as every person in this territory, whatever their name, whatever their blood, wherever they come from. Tommy was quiet. The younger boy had stopped crying. Some people don't like that, Tommy said carefully. Some people are wrong, Cole said. Being wrong loudly doesn't make a person right. Tommy looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the stick in his hand. We were on the letter G, he said. Show me, Cole said. So Tommy showed him. After the kitchen was closed and the last customer had gone, Cole found Amma sitting on the back step with a cup of tea going cold beside her. He sat down nearby, didn't ask permission, didn't fill the quiet with something. After a while, she spoke. She told him about her family's land, 50 acres west of town, 4 years ago. A legal proceeding was held in Fitch's courtroom in English, without translation, without anyone notifying her family in a language they understood. Notice was posted on a board outside the courthouse that her family had no reason to visit. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. No one spoke for them. The ruling was entered the same afternoon. They used the law to take our land, Amma said, and then they told us to use the law to get it back. She looked at her hands. The same law, the same judge, the same records office. Cole said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The people who benefit from a system are always the last to see it as a system, Amma continued. To them, it just looks like the way things are, the natural order. She glanced at him. You weren't born outside it. No, Cole said, but you've seen the inside of it. Yes, then you know how it's built, she said. You know where the walls are, where the doors are. That's a different kind of sight than most people have. She picked up her tea, found it cold, set it back down. The question is what a person does with that kind of sight, whether they use it the same way it was used on them, or the other way around. Cole looked out at the dark yard. The stars were coming up over the roofline, sharp and close, the way they only get at elevation. I used it the wrong way for a long time, he said. I know, Amma said. I can see that too. She stood up, collected her cup, and went inside. Cole sat on the back step for another hour, thinking about walls and doors and which direction a person chooses to walk through them. His room was dark when he got back to it. He lit the lamp on the small table beside the bed, took off his coat, sat on the edge of the mattress, and just breathed for a minute, the way you breathe at the end of a day that asked more of you than you'd been expecting. He reached for the drawer of the nightstand looking for nothing in particular, just the reflex of settling into a new space. His hand found something inside. He drew it out into the lamplight, a leather-bound field journal, worn at the corners. The cover had been handled many times. He could feel it in the texture of the leather, the softness that only comes from years of being picked up and set down. He turned it over. A name on the front, written in careful block letters with a carpenter's pencil. Frank Calloway, 1,882. Cole set it on the table, looked at it for a long time, without opening it. Then he opened it. Lamplight, at 2 in the morning, has a color that daylight doesn't. Amber, specific. The color of something held still. Something preserved against the dark by effort alone. Cole sat on the floor with his back against the foot of the bed and read Frank Calloway's journal from the first page. Outside, Dusty Creek was quiet in the way that towns learn to be quiet when noise draws the wrong kind of attention. He didn't hear anything except the lamp and his own breathing and the occasional creak of the building settling against the cold. Frank had written the way careful men write, not elegantly, precisely, Every detail recorded for reference. Every observation noted with the particular discipline of a man who trusted that facts mattered, and that writing them down was how you made sure they stayed facts and didn't drift into something easier to dismiss. Cole read slowly. He didn't hurry. The entry was dated August 1882. Frank wrote, 3 days of hard rain dropped Crooked Creek by nearly 18 inches. South bend of the creek, the one I've ridden past 100 times, had something showing in the mud that I'd never seen before. Thought it was a fence post at first. Went closer. It wasn't a fence post. Cole leaned forward. Cast iron old. Weathered, nearly black. I dug it out with my hands, took about 20 minutes. Survey, marker. Stamped with coordinates. A date and a name. Date, 1876. Name, H. Fitch. Surveyor. Cole read that line twice. I don't know the first name. I don't know if it's the same Fitch as our judge, but I'm going to find out. Because when I came home and pulled out my deed documents and compared them to the position of this marker, something didn't line up. The boundary this marker establishes the original boundary from 1876, before anyone built anything out here, puts the Crooked Creek water rights entirely inside my property lines, not on public land, not subject to county allocation. On my land. Mine, Cole set the journal on his knee. He stared at the wall for a moment. Then he kept reading. Frank had done the work carefully. Cross-referenced the marker coordinates against the official county map, against the deed documents filed when he bought the property in 1878, against a copy of the original territorial survey he'd gotten from the land office, from Fitch's office, before he understood what he was looking at. The discrepancy was not small. It was not a surveying error. It was a deliberate repositioning, the kind that required someone to know exactly what they were doing and why. Whoever placed the official county boundary markers had placed them in the wrong location, not by accident, by design. The Crooked Creek water rights had been on Callaway land since 1876, and someone had been pretending otherwise for years. Cole turned to the last entry. Frank wrote, I've written to the Federal Territorial Office in Albuquerque, not Santa Fe. I don't trust Santa Fe with this anymore. I've kept copies of everything. I've arranged it so Rose could find what she needs if something happens to me. A pause in the writing. Cole could feel it in the slight change of pressure on the page. She doesn't know any of this. I haven't told her, because I don't want her to be afraid. I keep telling myself that. But the real reason, the honest one, is that I haven't fully trusted that she could stand in this with me. And that's my failure, not hers. Rose is stronger than I've let myself believe. She's been stronger than me most of our marriage. If I'm being truthful about it, if something happens, she'll find this. She'll find everything I left. I just hope I have the courage to tell her myself first. The entry ended there. Cole closed the journal, set it on the floor beside him, pressed his hands flat against his knees, and looked at the lamplight on the ceiling for a long time. Frank Callaway had died 2 weeks after writing that entry. He had never told her. Cole found Silas at the Silver Star before it opened for the morning. The old man was alone, running a cloth down the bar in slow, deliberate strokes that didn't need doing. The bar was already clean. Busy hands for an uneasy mind. Cole set the journal on the bar between them. Silas looked at it, stopped moving the cloth. Where did you find that? Nightstand drawer in my room, Cole said. Someone left it there. Silas set the cloth down. He reached beneath the bar without hurrying and came up with an envelope. Old. The paper had gone soft at the edges, the way paper goes when it's been handled many times and then held still for a long time. He placed it on the bar beside the journal. Didn't pick it up again. Frank gave me that, Silas said, week before he died. He looked at the bar surface. He said, if anything happens to me, give this to someone who can use it. Cole waited. I've had it 16 months. The silence that followed had weight to it. Why now? Cole said. No accusation in it. Just the question. Silas turned the cloth over in his hands. I told myself I was protecting people. Rose, Tommy. Amma, he shook his head slowly. What I was actually doing was protecting myself. I knew that. I knew it every single morning. I just kept knowing it and not doing anything about it, which is its own kind of choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. He looked up. You stood up in this room 2 nights ago, said something no man in here has said in 2 years. And I woke up the next morning, and I finally understood something I'd been working very hard not to understand. He stopped. My silence wasn't keeping anyone safe. Every day I stayed quiet was another day. The man who killed Frank Calloway stayed protected. I kept telling myself those were different things. They weren't. They never were. Cole looked at the envelope. What's in it? Everything. Inside, a copy of the 1,876 survey document with H. Fitch's signature full name. Harrison Fitch, licensed surveyor, New Mexico Territory. A copy of the letter Frank sent to Albuquerque, with notation that the original was filed with the Federal Territorial Office. A hand-drawn map of Crooked Creek with the survey marker's position marked in pencil, and a single handwritten page. Frank's handwriting. 3 names. People who were present when Frank found the marker. People who saw it. Cole read the list. First name. A rancher who'd left the territory 8 months ago. Second name. A man named Davies. Cole checked the date Silas gave him. Davies died 7 months back. Ruled inconclusive by Deputy Malone. Third name. Deputy Ray Colton. Cole folded the page back into the envelope. Colton is still here. Still here. Silas confirmed. Still wearing his badge. Cole thought about that. Frank was careful. Frank was the most careful man I knew. Silas said. He built this like a man who understood that any single road might get blocked. So he built more than one road. He picked up his cloth again. Didn't save him, but it might save Rose. Cole brought the journal to Rose that afternoon. He set it on the bar table and told her what it was before she touched it, told her what was in it, told her about the survey marker and the water rights and the last entry, all of it, plain, without softening any of it, because she deserved the plain truth. She sat across from him and read. She read quickly, the efficient, focused speed of a woman who had been managing accounts and supply orders and contractor agreements for years, who read to find the thing, not to experience the reading. Her eyes moved down each page without hesitation. Cole watched her face. When she reached the last entry, she stopped, set the journal down with both hands, flat and deliberate, the way you set something down that might break something if you're not careful. She looked at a fixed point on the far wall. Her hands were completely still. The silence stretched out. He knew, she said finally. Her voice was level, controlled in the specific way of a person managing something very large. He knew for months. Cole didn't say anything. This wasn't a moment that needed filling. He was protecting me, she said, still quiet. Then she looked at Cole directly. He got himself killed, protecting me from the truth. She stopped, and I have been standing in this building for 16 months, with half a picture, half of what happened, half of who I was to him. Her jaw tightened. He was a good man. He was a good man in every way, except one. He didn't trust you with it, Cole said. He didn't trust me with it, she repeated, quietly, like the shape of it surprised her, even as she said it, not because he thought I was weak. He said so himself. He knew I was strong, but he chose not to believe it. And I don't know how to hold both those things. She looked at the journal. I don't know how to be angry at a man who's dead because he loved me wrong, Cole said. You don't have to know how. You just have to know it's true. She looked at him. He tried to protect you by keeping you in the dark, Cole said. That's not love failing. That's love making a decision about what you could handle without asking you. And the person who pays for that decision isn't the one who made it. Rose was quiet for a long time. He should have told me, she said finally. Yes, Cole said. He should have. not because I would have been fine. I don't know if I would have been fine, but because it was my life too, my land, my right to stand in the truth of my own situation. She pressed her palms flat against the table. You respect the people you love by trusting them with hard things, not by deciding for them what they can carry. She said it quietly and steadily, the way a person says something they've needed to say for a long time, without having had the words for it. Cole didn't argue with any of it. He said, I know. They worked through the documents together until past midnight. Rose cataloged and Cole mapped connections. Not much talking. The specific shared silence of two people doing necessary work in the same space. Each one present enough that the silence didn't feel empty. Rose reached across the table for a document. Cole had it already, passing it over. Their hands met over the paper, without either of them planning it. Neither pulled back immediately. Frank used to do that, Rose said. Her voice had shifted. Quieter. Hand me exactly what I was reaching for, before I asked. Cole, was that good or bad? It was Frank. A pause. You're not Frank. No, Cole said. I know. She took the document, went back to work. I just wanted to say it out loud. So we both know I know it. Cole looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the papers in front of him. Good, he said. We both know it. The lamp burned low. Neither of them reached to turn it up. Close to 3 in the morning, Cole said. I need to get into the land records office. Without Fitch knowing I was there. Rose didn't look up from the ledger in front of her. I figured I'll need a few hours. Tonight. Tomorrow night. She nodded, set her pen down, looked at the journal, still sitting on the corner of the table, then looked at Cole. There's something you should know, she said. Before you go doing anything in the dark. She paused. Silas wasn't just nearby when Frank died. He was 40 yards away. He watched it happen. The room was very still. He hasn't told me that himself yet, she said quietly. But he will. I've been waiting. She looked at her hands. I've been waiting for him to be ready to say the thing he already knows I know. Cole looked at her. How long have you known? Long enough, she said. Long enough to know that people carry things until they find someone to carry them to. That's not weakness. It's just the weight of being human. She stood, picked up her pen, went back to work, outside the window. Dusty Creek was dark and silent in every direction, but not the same dark it had been the night before. Something had shifted. Something had been set down and could not be picked back up again. Cole looked at the survey document in front of him, then at the journal, then at the woman across the table who had been standing alone in the truth of her own life for 16 months and was still standing. He turned back to the work. Fire in the New Mexico desert doesn't ask permission. 1 minute, the dark is just the dark. The next minute, it has a color and a sound and a heat that moves toward you before you've finished understanding what you're looking at. Cole woke to the horses. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of the particular quiet that horses make when they're settled. He was out of bed before he was fully awake. Coat pulled on over his shirt, boots in his hand, moving toward the window. Orange light, south end of the property. The livery. He was down the stairs and through the back door in under a minute. The south wall was already going when he got there. Whoever said it had used oil, you could smell it over the smoke. Sharp and deliberate. This was not a lamp knocked over. This was a message, and the message was being delivered loud. Tommy Wren was already outside with 2 horses, speaking to them low in Navajo, walking them away from the building, with both hands steady on their halters. The horses were listening. He'd learned that trick young. Keep your voice below the panic. Stay slower than the thing that's frightening them. And most of the time, they'll follow you toward calm. Cole went in through the side door, smoke low and moving. He could still see. He took the first 2 stalls, fast both empty. Doors already open. Tommy had been through here. 3rd stall. 4th. 5th stall was the problem. A young colt, maybe 18 months, pressed into the far corner with his head down and his eyes white-rimmed. The lead rope was right there, hanging on the post. Cole reached for it. The colt threw his head back and slammed into the corner wall. Cole stopped. He stood completely still, one hand up, open, not reaching. He dropped his voice to almost nothing, not words exactly, just sound, low and even and without urgency. He kept his body loose, made himself breathe at a normal pace, even though the smoke was thickening, and the heat from the south wall was something he could feel on the back of his neck. Stayed still. The colt's ears came forward. Still. The horse's breathing changed still fast, but less ragged. He turned his head slightly and looked at Cole sideways, the way horses look when they're deciding. Cole took one step forward, slow, placed his palm flat on the horse's nose, stood there. The colt shuddered once, all over like something releasing. Then he dropped his head into Cole's hand. Cole took the lead rope and walked him out at a steady pace. Not hurrying, the horse came with him. Outside, Tommy was there. Cole handed the lead rope over and bent forward with his hands on his knees, coughing the smoke out of his lungs. His right hand was burning. He'd touched the stall door frame. On the way out, without noticing, Tommy looked at Cole's hand, then at the colt. How did you do that? Cole straightened up. Patience doesn't always look like doing something, he said. Sometimes it looks like being still long enough for a frightened thing to remember you're not the threat. He flexed his burned fingers. Works on horses. Works on people too. Tommy looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the colt, who was pressing his nose into Tommy's shoulder now, trembling but breathing. Yeah, Tommy said. It does by the time Rose came out the back door. The fire was contained to the south wall. 3 men from neighboring properties had shown up with water. Another hour, and the structure was saved damaged. Smoke blackened. One wall needing full replacement, but standing. Rose stood in the yard and looked at it for a long time. Cole stood beside her. His hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth Tommy had found somewhere. It would need proper attention, but it could wait. Prescott, Rose said. Not a question. His people, Cole said. Not him directly. He'll make sure he wasn't anywhere near it. She nodded. Something hardened in her face, not anger exactly. Resolution. The particular kind that comes from having suspected something and now knowing it for certain. Prescott arrived at 7 in the morning with Deputy Ray Colton at his side and a notebook he opened and closed twice without writing anything in it. He walked the perimeter of the livery with the performative thoroughness of a man conducting an investigation he has no intention of completing, honestly. He looked at the south wall. He looked at the ground. He did not look at the obvious pore pattern around the foundation, the dark stain in the dirt, where oil had been splashed deliberately against the base of the building before the fire was set. Cole stood near the stable door and watched him not look at it. A small group had gathered, mourning people. A few ranchers who'd helped with the water, the woman from the dry goods store who'd brought a bucket and stayed, Cody from the neighboring property, still a teenager, hat in his hands. Prescott closed his notebook. Accidental, he said to the group. Pleasantly. Lamp ignition. Most likely. These things happen in dry conditions. I'd recommend Mrs. Calloway review her storage practices. Rose stepped forward. Her voice was completely even. No trembling, no performance of outrage. Just a woman stating what was true. Sheriff. Someone poured oil along that foundation wall. The pour pattern is visible from where you're standing right now. I'm asking you to document that observation in your official report. Prescott smiled. A woman's speculation is not speculation. It's direct observation. Rose did not raise her voice. And a woman's direct observation carries the same evidential weight as anyone else's. But what I actually want in your report, Sheriff, is the specific list of things you chose not to document this morning, because I am keeping my own record. She looked around at the people standing there, and there are witnesses to the fact that I asked. Nobody spoke, but 2 people nodded. Just barely, just enough. Prescott held his pleasant expression for another 3 seconds. Then he closed his notebook and tucked it under his arm. "Friday, Mrs. Calloway," he said. "We'll speak Friday." He and Colton walked back toward Main Street. Cole watched them go. He watched how Colton walked slightly behind Prescott, slightly small. The practiced body language of a man who had spent years making himself less than he was. He filed it away. Silas had come out at some point and was standing near the wall. He said nothing to anyone. But Cole noticed that Silas was looking at the pour stain in the dirt the same way Cole was looking at it, both of them knowing what it was. The smaller saloon near the stockyards was called Harker's, and it opened at 11. Cole was there before noon. Ray Colton was in the corner, alone. His badge was on his belt, but his hat was low, and the way he was holding his glass, not drinking from it, just turning it, said everything about where his mind was. Cole crossed the room and sat down across from him without being invited. Colton looked up. Something moved through his face, a quick internal adjustment, like a man putting on a coat he doesn't want to wear. "Callahan Hardin," Cole said. "Right." Colton set the glass down. "You're making a habit of sitting where you're not asked." "You were at Crooked Creek," Cole said. "When Frank Calloway found that survey marker, you were there." Colton's jaw tightened. He looked at the table. "I'm not asking if it's true," Cole said. "I know it's true. I'm asking you to consider what it means that you've been living with it for 16 months. You don't understand the situation. Help me understand it." A long silence. Colton turned his glass. "I have a wife, 2 kids. Youngest is 4 years old." He looked up. "You know what Prescott does to people who cause him problems. You've been here 3 days, you already know." "I know," Cole said. "Then you know it's not simple." "I know it's not simple," Cole said. "I also know that staying quiet doesn't protect your family. Prescott has been operating in this valley for 9 years. He has been getting bolder for 9 years. That doesn't stop." Cole looked at him steadily. "If he's willing to kill Frank Calloway over a water rights claim, he's already past the point of leaving inconvenient people alone. Staying quiet doesn't put your family out of reach. It just means the man threatening them stays protected." Colton said nothing. "I'm not asking you for anything today," Cole said. "I'm just asking you to stop pretending those are different things." He left Colton with his glass and his silence. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes you just had to put the truth on the table and walk away and let a man sit with it in private. The evening was cold and clear, the sky going dark blue above the roofline. Cole found Amma on the back step. She was sitting with her hands loose in her lap, not doing anything, just being still in the particular way of someone who has learned to exist in difficult circumstances without spending all their energy fighting the fact of them. Cole sat nearby. He didn't speak first. He'd learned that much in 3 days. After a while, Amma spoke. She told him about her family's land, 50 acres on the west side of the valley. Her grandfather had worked that ground. Her father had been born on it. She had learned to walk on it. 4 years ago, a proceeding was held in Fitch's courtroom, in English, no translation. The notice was posted on a board outside the courthouse. A board her family had no reason to visit because their business was on their land, not in town. The hearing was 40 minutes. No one spoke on their behalf. No one explained what was being decided, or that they had the right to contest it. The ruling was entered that same afternoon. "They used the law to take our land," Amma said, "and when I tried to fight it, they told me to use the law to get it back. The same law, the same judge, the same records." She looked at her hands. A circle with no door. Cole thought about the triangle of buildings he'd mapped that morning. The 3 points. The no-exit design. The people who benefit from a system are always the last to see it as a system. Amma continued. "To them, it just looks like the natural order, the way things are." She glanced at him. "You grew up inside it." "Yes," Cole said, "but you've seen the inside of it from the working side. You know how it's built. where the walls are load-bearing and where they're just for show. She looked at the stars coming up over the roofline. That's not nothing. Most people who grow up inside a system never even get that. They just know it works for them, and they stop asking why. I used that knowledge wrong for a long time, Cole said. I know. I'd like to use it differently now. Amma was quiet for a moment. Then use it. Don't just feel bad about the other way. She stood, went inside without ceremony. Cole sat in the cold for a while, thinking about the difference between remorse and repair. They were not the same thing. Remorse was something you felt. Repair was something you did. He'd been doing a lot of feeling for 4 years. Rose was closing down the bar when Cole came back inside. The last 2 customers had just left. Silas was wiping glasses. The lamp on the far wall was turned low. Cole sat on the back step of the building, the step that looked out over the dark yard, where the livery still smelled faintly of smoke and oil, and the particular char of close calls. Rose came out a few minutes later and sat down beside him. Not close enough to touch, close enough to share the cold. I'm not afraid of him, she said. I know, Cole said, but I think about Tommy, about Amma. She looked at the yard. About Silas. He's 63 years old, and he has nowhere else to go. If this place goes, then we make sure it doesn't go, Cole said. It sat in the air between them. Rose turned and looked at him sideways. That's the second time you've said that. It's the second time I've meant it. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight from inside caught the edge of her face, the set of her jaw, exhaustion she carried carefully. The way you carry something you don't want to put down, because you're not sure you could pick it back up. I've been doing this alone for 16 months, she said. I know. I don't need someone to do it for me. I know that too. She stopped. Started again. I'm tired of the alone part. That's all. I'm not saying anything more than that right now. You don't have to, Cole said. That's enough for now. They sat for a while in the cold and the quiet, not talking, not filling it. Just 2 people sitting at the edge of something, without yet deciding what to call it. 2 in the morning. The land records office was dark. Cole went in through the back window, the way he'd scouted 2 days ago. He moved through the room without a light, navigating by memory, and the faint street lamp glow through the front glass. He found what he came for. The records were organized by year and parcel number, the way a methodical man organizes things when he wants to be able to find what he needs quickly and make sure other people can't. Cole worked through the relevant files with a small candle shielded in his cupped hand. He got what he needed. Got out. He was in the alley, 10 feet from the back door, tucking the documents into his coat. 2 shapes stepped out of the dark. 2 in the morning in an alley has no witnesses, no rank, no badge, no courthouse seal, just the dark and the specific arithmetic of 2 men against 1, and what each of them wants badly enough to bleed for. Cole heard them before he saw them, the particular sound of boots shifting position in dirt, the way men move when they've been waiting in one spot long enough to go stiff and are just now allowing themselves to move. He turned. 2 shapes. The one on the left was Decker. He recognized the build, the way the man held his shoulders. The other one he hadn't placed yet. Give us the papers, Decker said. Cole said nothing. Decker moved first. It wasn't a clean fight. Nothing fought in the dark in a narrow alley ever is. Decker came in fast and low, and Cole had 1 second to decide. Step left toward the wall. Step right toward the other man. Or hold position. He held position, which meant he took the full force of Decker's shoulder into his ribs and went down to 1 knee on the alley dirt. The pain was immediate and specific. Cracked, maybe. He'd know later. The second man came in from the right, while Cole was down. He took a boot heel to the left shoulder that drove him sideways, hit the wall with his forearm, used it to push back up. Not clean, not fast, just up. Because the thing about men who do this for money, they expect the target to stay down the second time. Cole didn't stay down. He came up inside the second man's reach and put his elbow into the man's jaw in one short, economical motion. The man's head snapped back. He sat down hard in the dirt and didn't get up immediately. Decker came again with a knife this time. Cole stepped back, kept stepping back. Decker was good with a knife. He held it right, moved with it, wasn't showing off. Cole had 2 inches of reach on him, and a right hand that was already burned from the livery fire and wrapped in cloth and therefore mostly useless. He used it anyway. The trick wasn't to fight the knife. The trick was to stop the wrist holding it. He got the wrist, pivoted hard. The knife hit the dirt. Decker hit the wall. Cole put his forearm across Decker's throat, not squeezing. Just there, just the weight and the statement of it. Go, Cole said. Decker went. The second man had found his feet and followed, without looking back. Cole stood in the dark alley, breathing through his teeth. One hand pressed to his right side, where the ribs screamed. The documents still inside his coat. He checked them with his burned hand, and the pain was worth it, because they were there. He stood there for another minute until his breathing evened out. Then he walked back to the Silver Star. Rose was awake. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp on low and a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. She looked at Cole when he came through the back door, looked at the way he was holding his side, at his hand. She didn't say, "I told you this would happen." She didn't ask if he was all right. She stood up and got the medicine box. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She worked on his hand, first unwrapped the cloth from the livery fire, examined the burn, cleaned it properly this time. Her hands were steady and unhurried. She'd done this before, probably more times than he'd want to know, while she worked. Cole pulled the documents from inside his coat and spread them on the table with his free hand. 2 things at once: her tending to what he'd paid, him starting to account for what he'd bought with it. "You got beaten up for those," Rose said, without looking up from his hand. "Decker hit back when I reached for them," Cole said. "That's generally what happens when you reach for something someone is hiding. Is that enough reason? It means we're close enough to the truth that it was worth hitting back for." He looked at the documents. "That's exactly enough reason." She looked at him then, just for a moment. The lamp between them made the shadows long. "You could have been killed," she said. "Doing the right thing doesn't come with a guarantee of safety," Cole said. "If it did, it wouldn't take any courage. It'd just take timing." She held his gaze for a beat, then went back to his hand. The picture, assembled. Cole laid it out slowly. The way you lay out a thing you want someone to see completely, rather than piece by piece. Rose sat across from him with both hands flat on the table, listening. Harrison Fitch, Judge Harlan Fitch's father, had conducted the original survey of the Crooked Creek region in 1876. He was a licensed territorial surveyor. He was also, as Cole had confirmed from the Land Records Office tonight, a founding partner in a land-holding entity called the Crooked Creek Water Concern, incorporated quietly under a business associate's name in 1877. The entity held an informal claim to the creek's water rights, not a legal claim, an informal one structured in paperwork that looked like a routine business registration, but pointed, if you followed the chain of instruments, back to water access rights that the official survey had been drawn to protect. Harrison Fitch died in 1881. His son Harlan inherited everything, including the paperwork, including the informal claim, including the knowledge of where the survey markers actually were and what they actually established. The Railroad Consortium had been in discussions with Harlan Fitch, not with the county, not with any public authority about water access for a southern route. The deal required clear title. Clear title required the Callaway property to not exist as an independent claim. Wade Prescott was the enforcement arm, had been for 9 years. Frank Callaway found the original survey marker, the one that proved the Fitch family had known about the true water rights since 1876. had built an entire apparatus around, concealing that knowledge, and had been operating on the wrong side of the law in doing so. Frank wrote to the Federal Territorial Office in Albuquerque. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Rose listened to all of it without interrupting. When Cole finished, she was quiet for a moment. The letter Frank sent to Albuquerque, she said. Did anyone there act on it? I don't know yet. That's the next question. Who in Albuquerque can you trust? One person, Cole said. Maybe. He paused. A federal marshal named James Holt. I did some work for him years ago. What kind of work? He looked at the table. Legal work. Mostly, she said. Mostly, she looked at him steadily. I need to know who I'm trusting with the rest of this. Not the general shape of it, the specific thing. Cole set down the document he was holding. He'd known this was coming. He'd been waiting for it the way you wait for weather. You can already smell on the wind. I scouted for a land acquisition company, he said. Private company, operating in New Mexico and West Texas. My job was to find land with water access, identify the weak points in existing claims, boundary disputes, filing errors, missing documentation, and map out the approach. The company used that to run campaigns against landowners. Legal pressure first. Other things, when legal pressure didn't work. Rose said nothing. I told myself I was just finding the ground, that I was just the scout, that the decisions about what happened to the people on that land weren't mine to own. But I knew what I was scouting for. Every time. I knew what would happen after I handed over the report. I did it anyway. He looked at his hands. Because the money was good, and because it was easier than stopping. What made you stop? Cole was quiet for a moment. A man standing in a doorway, he said. Navajo man. 3 children behind him. We came with the paperwork and the guns, and he just stood there. He didn't fight, didn't beg, just looked at me. A pause. The way you look at something you already know the end of. And I understood, standing there, that I had been the beginning of a lot of endings. And I had spent years calling each one someone else's decision. Was that true? No, Cole said. I knew what I was scouting for. I put the information in people's hands, knowing what they'd do with it. That's not being adjacent to a thing. That's being part of it. Rose studied him. You left that day, walked off the job, never went back. And you think leaving was enough. The question landed the way she'd meant it to land. Direct and without cruelty. No, Cole said. Leaving was just the first step. It's the only step that doesn't cost you anything except comfort. He looked at the documents spread across the table between them. This is a different kind of step. Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then all right, she said. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Just the decision to keep going with the facts she had. That was enough. They found Tommy at the livery an hour later. The boy was awake. He hadn't slept much since the fire, keeping close to the horses the way he always did. When something had disturbed them, he was sitting in the open stable door with a lantern and a rope he was braiding by feel in the dark. Cole sat down on the fence rail across from him, laid out the plan. He needed someone to carry the documents to Albuquerque, to Marshal Holt. He needed someone Prescott wasn't watching. Tommy listened without interrupting. When Cole finished, Tommy said, "You need someone invisible. I need someone nobody pays attention to," Cole said, "which in this town means you." Tommy looked at him directly. "How long would it take me?" "Normal route. 2 days hard riding." Each way Tommy was quiet for a moment. Something worked in his face, not hesitation, but calculation. "Then I know another way." "What way?" "Canyon Trail. West side of the valley." He set the rope down. Pre-settlement Navajo route. Cuts through the Mesa country on the north side of the canyon system. It's not on any county map because nobody surveyed it. The county surveyors didn't go that far off the main lines. He paused. "I can do it in 8 hours." Cole looked at him. "You're sure about it?" Tommy gave him the patient, slightly tired look of a boy who had been answering variations of this question his entire life. "My grandfather mapped that trail before your grandfather knew this territory existed." I've ridden it 6 times. Yes, I'm sure about it. Cole held that for a moment. Then I didn't mean to question it. I know what you meant, Tommy said. Not unkind, just exact. People assume I don't know things, or that the things I know don't count the same as the things in official records. He picked the rope back up. Our trail doesn't appear on their maps because they didn't bother to map it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means they didn't look. Cole was quiet. The people a system doesn't bother to see, Tommy said, sometimes have the clearest view of it, because we've been watching it from the outside our whole lives. Cole looked at the boy in the lantern light, 16 years old, braiding rope in the dark after someone burned his stable, making plans with the particular steadiness of someone who has never had the luxury of coming apart. I'll have everything ready by tomorrow night, Cole said. Full account for Holt. Documents. Map of what we have and where it came from. He paused. Tommy, you understand the risk? Mr. Calloway was good to me, Tommy said. And Mrs. Rose has been good to Amma. And Amma is my family. He looked up. You're asking me if I understand the risk like. It's a reason I might say no. But those are exactly the reasons I say yes. Cole nodded. Come find me tomorrow night, Tommy said. Before midnight, Cole stood up, walked back toward the Silver Star. Behind him, the sound of rope moving through Tommy's hands, in the dark patient, and steady and already working. He found Silas in the Silver Star at 3 in the morning, not behind the bar, sitting on a stool in front of it, hat in his hands, turning it the way old men turn hats when they've been working up to something. Cole stopped in the doorway. Silas looked up. His face had the particular expression of a man who has finally decided to set something heavy down after carrying it too long. The relief of it and the cost of it, both at once. I was at Crooked Creek, Silas said, the day Frank died. He set his hat on the bar. I need to tell you what I saw. 5 in the morning. The sky over Dusty Creek was the color that comes before everything else, not night anymore, not dawn yet, but the specific electric blue-gray of a sky that hasn't made up its mind. That particular hour, when anything still feels possible and nothing feels certain. Cole was in the kitchen when Silas finished talking. He didn't rush the old man, didn't push for more than Silas had. He just sat with what had been laid in front of him and let it settle the way you let sediment settle in water before you try to read the bottom. Silas had been 40 yards away. He'd watched it happen. He'd walked back to the Silver Star afterward and sat down at the piano and played for 3 hours until his hands stopped shaking. And then he had gotten up the next morning and opened the bar and poured drinks and said nothing to anyone for 16 months. Why now? Cole had asked, at the end of it. The same question he'd asked before, but this time the weight behind it was different. Silas had looked at his hat on the bar, because I realized something last night that I'd been avoiding knowing. He stopped, started again. There's a difference between silence that protects people and silence that protects the person who hurt them. I kept telling myself I was doing the first thing, but I was doing the second. He looked up. Every single day for 16 months, I was doing the second thing, and Rose was standing in that building alone. Because of it. He picked up his hat. I'm done with that now, he said, whatever it costs. Cole had walked him home. The streets were empty. Nobody saw. He was back at the livery before 4. Tommy was already there, packed Light One's saddlebag. Documents inside a waterproof pouch tucked against his body. Not in the bag. He'd thought of that himself. Cole hadn't suggested it. You have the letter for Holt inside my coat, Tommy said, along with the copies. Originals stay with Mrs. Rose. You know what to say if someone stops you on the road. I'm running a message to the feed supply office in Albuquerque for Mrs. Calloway. I have the name of the supplier, and I know the street. He had practiced it twice. It sounded easy and unimportant. It was neither. If Holt isn't there, I wait. If he's not back in 12 hours, I leave the package with the duty deputy, with the seal you gave me on the outside, and I ride home. Cole nodded. 8 hours. 8 hours, Tommy said. Maybe 7 if the North Canyon is clear. He mounted up. Cole stepped back. Then Decker stepped out of the dark at the south gate. He was alone, hat low, standing square in the middle of the road, with no pretense about what he was doing there. Where you headed? Boy, the word landed the way it was intended to land. Tommy stopped his horse. His face didn't change. This was not the first time someone had stood in his way. It was not the 10th time. He had learned a long time ago that showing them what the words hit would only give them more to throw. He reached for the reins to go around. Decker stepped left, blocked the path, reached out and took hold of the horse's bridle. Cole came out of the shadow of the feed store wall where he'd been standing since 3:30. He didn't run, just walked forward at a steady pace. Stopped 10 feet from Decker. Take your hand off the bridle. Decker turned. He looked at Cole and then back at Tommy and then at Cole again. Running the math. Cole raised his voice not in anger, but in volume, deliberately, so that the 2 windows above the street and the figure he'd seen behind the curtain of the boarding house would hear it clearly. That boy is riding out of this town on his own legal business. Nobody is stopping him. I want that to be heard and understood by anyone who can hear me. Right now, a light went on in the boarding house window, then one across the street. Decker looked at the windows, then at Cole. He let go of the bridle and stepped back. Tommy rode. Cole stood in the street and watched him go until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the dark of the canyon road. Then he turned and walked back toward the Silver Star without looking at Decker again. Behind him, a door opened somewhere on the street. A man's voice. Quiet. Everything all right out here? Cole didn't answer, but he heard the question, and it mattered. Someone had opened a door. Prescott came at 2 in the afternoon, a day early. He came with Judge Harlan Fitch, which was something new. Fitch rarely appeared in person for these things. He preferred the distance of signed documents and official channels. The fact that he was here in the Silver Star, in his good coat, and his courthouse authority meant the timeline had moved. Cole was at his table. He did not get up. Fitch placed a folder on the bar. Official county seal embossed on the front. His name on the tab. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to in rooms where no one contradicts him. Educated, careful, pleasant in a different way than Prescott's pleasant, less menace. More architecture. I'm here in my capacity as County Land Commissioner. A routine re-examination of property records has identified a boundary discrepancy in the original Calloway deed filing. Rose looked at the folder without touching it. What kind of discrepancy? A surveying error in the original document, Prescott said, stepping in. 1/3 of the Crooked Creek parcel has been placed in disputed status pending resolution. You'll want to review who authorized the re-examination, Rose asked. Fitch, the county land office, conducts routine your office, Rose said. You authorized a survey of my private property without notifying me, without my knowledge. Standard procedure when an anomaly is identified. Who identified the anomaly? A pause. Just brief. But there. The county land office, your office, Rose said again. Quiet, exact. The same office that has a documented financial relationship with a railroad consortium currently seeking water access rights along the southern route. She looked at Fitch directly. You authorized a re-examination of land that directly affects your own financial interests. And then you signed the findings yourself. Fitch's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted a small recalibration. The way a man recalibrates when the ground he expected to be soft turns out to be something else. You have 24 hours to acknowledge the dispute and territorial law, Rose said, requires that a property owner receive independent verification and legal representation before acknowledging or acting on any disputed survey finding. That is not a regional courtesy. That is the law of this territory. She looked at him steadily. Every person in this territory has that right, including me, including a woman running a saloon in a small town who doesn't have a law degree. She had read that section of the territorial code 3 times in the 2 years since Frank died. She had read it because Frank had told her once years ago, during a different disagreement with a different party, that knowing your rights was not the same as having them honored. But it was the first step toward it. She was using the first step now. Prescott moved. 2 steps. Fast. The kind of movement that ends conversations and starts something else. The door opened. Cole walked in, not fast, not with any drama. He simply came through the door in the way he always came through doors quietly, already decided. The particular arrival of a man who has made up his mind before the door swings open. He crossed to the bar, set an envelope down next to Fitch's folder. The federal marshal's office in Albuquerque received a full accounting of the Crooked Creek water rights situation last night, he said, including the 1,876 survey documentation and the chain of instruments connecting the Fitch family to the Crooked Creek water concern. He said it the way you state a fact. No performance. No raised voice. The room went absolutely still. Prescott stared at him. You're bluffing. You could assume that, Cole said. Wait and see how it plays. He looked at the folder on the bar. Or you could consider that a federal marshal, with documentation of a fraudulent resurvey, signed by a county official, with a personal financial stake in the outcome, is going to have something to say about that. He paused. That's not a bluff. That's a description of what happens next. Prescott took a step forward. Decker, who had come in behind Prescott and stationed himself near the far wall, moved. Don't, Cole said. He didn't look at Decker when he said it. He didn't need to. He said it the way you say something that is simply true without threat, without drama, with the complete certainty of a man who has been in enough rooms like this one to know exactly how it goes when someone makes the wrong move. Decker stopped. The side door opened. Ray Colton came in. He was in uniform. He walked to the bar with the particular gait of a man carrying something he has been carrying for a long time and is finally setting it down. He placed a document on the bar, handwritten, dated, signed. Sworn statement, he said. His voice was not steady, but it was clear. I was present at Crooked Creek when Frank Calloway found the survey marker. I was ordered by Sheriff Prescott to file an inaccurate accident report following Mr. Calloway's death. This is my corrected account, witnessed and notarized this morning. He stepped back. He did not look at Prescott. He looked at Rose. The room was completely silent. Rose had both hands flat on the bar, chin level, eyes on Prescott. She was not performing anything. She was not doing anything theatrical or triumphant. She was simply standing there in her place, behind her bar, on the property that was hers, with the particular stillness of a woman who made her decision a long time ago and has been waiting for the ground to catch up. Prescott looked around the room. 2 ranchers near the window. The woman from the dry goods store who had shown up to help with the fire and apparently stayed. Old Silas behind the bar, with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes level. Ray Colton standing to Rose's right. Prescott picked up Fitch's folder. He closed it. He walked to the door. Fitch followed, the way a man follows when he understands the room has changed and departure is the only available move. At the threshold, Prescott stopped, did not turn around. This isn't over, he said. Cole, no. But Frank Calloway started it. We're finishing what he left. The door swung shut. The spurs faded down the boardwalk for the last time. Nobody moved for 5 full seconds. Then Silas set both hands on the bar and exhaled a long, slow breath, the kind that carries weight out of the body along with the air. He looked at the room, at the people who had stayed, at Rose. I was silent for 16 months, he said, out loud, to everyone, while a woman stood alone in this building against a man who killed her husband. I told myself I was afraid. That's true. But being afraid isn't the same as being right. He looked at his hands. What I did, what I didn't do, I want everyone in this room to understand that silence in a situation like this doesn't protect innocent people. It protects the person causing the harm. Those are not the same thing. I got them confused for a long time. Nobody said anything, but nobody looked away either. Outside the Silver Star, the street had gone quiet in the specific way of a street where something has just happened, that people are still working out how to hold. Cole stood on the boardwalk. Tommy was still on the road, a day away, maybe less. Whether Holt was in Albuquerque or out in the field, whether the documents would reach him in time, none of that was settled yet. But something had shifted. Something had been said out loud in that room that couldn't be unsaid. Rose came out and stood beside him. She didn't speak right away. She looked at the street, at the ordinary afternoon of it, the horses at the rail, the kid sweeping out the barber shop, the woman hanging laundry on the line above the dry goods store. Was that a bluff? She asked finally. About Holt already having the documents. Half a bluff, Cole said. Tommy has them. He's on the road. Holt doesn't have them yet. Rose absorbed that. You bet everything on Prescott not being certain. The best bluffs are the ones where you're only lying about the timing, Cole said, not the facts. She looked at him sideways. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but the direction of one, the first he'd seen from her, even at that incomplete degree. You are a very strange man. Cole Hardin, she said. I know, he said. They stood on the boardwalk together and watched Dusty Creek go about its afternoon. It looked the same as it had yesterday. Same buildings, same people, same street. But it wasn't. There are moments when a whole town breathes at once, not because anyone chose to, not because someone said now, but because everything else stopped moving, and the lungs filled on their own, and suddenly everyone in the room was in the same breath at the same time. The Silver Star was quiet, not the careful quiet of people managing their noise. The released quiet of people who have been holding something tight for a long time and have just been told they can let go. Tommy came back the next morning. Cole heard the horse before he heard anything else, the particular rhythm of a tired animal covering the last distance home, steady and honest and slower than the outbound pace. He was off his chair and at the door before Rose had come downstairs. Tommy rode in from the West Canyon Road as the sun was clearing the ridgeline. He looked tired in the way of someone who had been moving without stopping and was running on decision rather than rest. His coat was dusty. His face was calm. He dismounted at the livery, and Cole was there to take the horse. Holt met his field party 12 miles outside of Albuquerque, Tommy said. He pulled the waterproof pouch from inside his coat, empty now. He'd been riding toward Dusty Creek. He already had a federal complaint open. He handed Cole the pouch. He said to tell you he'd received the complaint 3 months ago, but didn't have the final piece. Said what I brought was the final piece. He said it matter-of-factly, without swelling up around it. Cole looked at the boy for a moment. You rode through the night, Cole said. Trails easier in the dark, Tommy said. Less wind through the canyon. He took his horse's reins back. I'm going to water her and sleep. Wake me if something happens. He walked his horse into the stable, without looking back. Cole stood at the stable door and thought about what Earl had said about water following the lowest path, finding its way regardless of what you put in front of it. Frank Calloway had built a case with the understanding that truth needed more than one road to travel. He'd been right. He just hadn't lived to see which road it took. Holt arrived at noon with 2 federal deputies. He came through the Silver Star door like a man who had been to many rooms like this one and understood exactly what each of them required. Medium height, somewhere in his 50s, a face that had been out in weather for 30 years and wore it without complaint. His authority came from stillness rather than size, the particular authority of someone who does not need to fill a room, because the room already knows he's in it. He identified himself, read the warrants, stated the charges. Prescott stood in the middle of the Silver Star and heard his name attached to things that were no longer rumors or suspicions, or the kind of accusations that get smoothed over by a county judge's signature. They were federal charges, federal warrants, federal authority. He looked around the room one more time. The ranchers near the window. Ray Colton standing to Rose's right, Silas behind the bar. Two women Cole hadn't seen before, standing near the door they'd come in. Off the street, when the word moved, the way word moves in small towns, not through announcement, but through frequency. Every face held. Not one person looked away. This is not how this ends, Prescott said to Cole. Cole said, I think it is. Prescott looked at him for a long moment. His pleasant expression was gone. What was underneath it was something smaller and less certain. The face of a man who built his power on other people's fear, and is only now understanding what it looks like when the fear runs out. He went quietly. That surprised some people later, but Cole understood it. Men like Prest went quietly when the room turned, because the room turning was the one thing they hadn't built a response for. Fitch, beside him, said nothing at all. He had been saying nothing in his particular, strategic way for his entire career. Even now, with the handcuffs. The silence was deliberate. A man making sure nothing he said could be used. The door closed behind them. The Silver Star exhaled before anyone else was processed, before the legal machinery had fully engaged. Holt went to where Amma was standing near the kitchen doorway. He crossed the room specifically to reach her. That was not nothing. Cole watched him do it. Ma'am, he held his hat in his hands. Not performed deference, actual respect. The real kind that looks like a small thing and isn't. Your family filed a federal complaint 3 months ago regarding the 1,879 land proceeding in this county. Amma looked at him. That complaint has been formally received and opened for federal review, Holt said. Your family's case will be heard by a federal examiner. You will be contacted directly, not through the county land office, not through any territorial channel that has been connected to Judge Fitch. Directly. Amma studied him for a moment. Her face was not warm. It was not cold either. It was the face of a woman applying a reasonable standard. I have heard promises from officials before, she said. I understand that. Officials who had authority, who seemed sincere, who did not follow through. I understand that too, Holt said. Then you understand why I am not going to thank you right now, Amma said. I will write down your name and your office address and the date you said this to me, and I will hold you to it. That is exactly what you should do, Holt said. I would not respect you if you didn't. Amma looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, not agreement, not gratitude, but acknowledgement. I hear you. The rest remains to be seen. She went back to the kitchen. Holt turned and found Cole standing nearby. She'll write that letter, Holt said quietly. I know, Cole said. Good, Holt said. I'll answer it. The room unfolded slowly after that. The woman near the window sat down suddenly. Like her legs had just remembered they were tired. The man beside her put his hand on her shoulder, and she didn't move away. A rancher from the back took his hat off and looked at it for a long moment. Silas sat down on his piano bench, not to play, just to sit. The particular heaviness of old bones at the end of something long. Tommy came in through the back, still trail dusty, and stood in the middle of the room. Amma came out of the kitchen and walked to him and took his face-aced, both her hands, the way she had when he was small, when he'd come back from somewhere difficult, and she was making sure he was whole. He let her. He was 16, and he was not too old for it, and they both knew it. Cole watched all of this from his corner. He was not at the center of it. That was correct. That was how it should be. This was not his town. These were not his people, not yet. Not fully. He had walked into a room that was already fighting. and added his weight to the right side. But the room had been fighting before he arrived. Rose had been fighting for 16 months. Tommy had been watching and waiting. Silas had finally spoken. Ray Colton had written a sworn account. The room had done this. He was part of it, but only part. Late afternoon, the Silver Star was emptying. Holt and his deputies had taken statements and left to process things in the official channels that official things require. Ray Colton had gone to file his own paperwork. The ranchers had drifted back to their properties. What remained was Silas asleep at his piano bench, with his head on his folded arms, and the particular deep silence of a man who has been awake for too long and has finally put something down heavy enough to let him rest. Rose and Cole were at the bar, not talking, not needing to. After a while, Rose said, "You said the bluff was only about the timing." "Yes." Holt had the complaint already. 3 months old. "Yes." "So you knew when you made the bluff that the facts were real," Cole said, "just not yet in his hands. There's a difference between lying and being ahead of the timeline." Rose looked at him. "That is a very fine distinction." "It worked," Cole said. Something moved across her face. It did. She poured 2 glasses, set one in front of him. "Nora," she said. Cole looked at his glass. "You wrote her," Rose said. "Before all of this." "Yes." "Are you afraid of the answer?" Cole's quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Good," Rose said. He looked up. "Fear means it matters to you," she said. "People who aren't afraid of things that matter aren't actually paying attention. They've already decided they don't really care about the outcome." She picked up her glass. "You care about this one. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." Cole held that. "I left when she was 16. He said. "She's 23 now. 7 years is a long time to be someone's absent father." "It is," Rose said. She didn't soften it. "I told myself it was better for her, that I wasn't good for her to be around." Was that true? Cole thought about it honestly. "Partly," he said. "The part that was true was that I was doing something I was ashamed of, and I didn't want her to see it. The part that wasn't true was the rest of it, that she was better off without me entirely. That was convenient. It let me go without having to sit with the full weight of what I was doing." Rose listened. "I didn't leave for her sake," Cole said. "I left for mine. It was easier to be gone than to be seen clearly by someone who loved me. She knows that." Rose said, "I know she knows. So whatever comes next, you can't lead with an explanation. She's already built the explanation herself. She's had 7 years. Cole, then what do I lead with?" Rose looked at him steadily. "The truth, not why you left and what it meant and how you've changed. She doesn't need your account of yourself. She needs something simpler." She set her glass down. "I failed you. I know it. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I would like to know you if you'll allow it. Nothing else. No explanation attached. No request for anything in return." Cole was quiet. "That's it. That's it," Rose said. "Anything more is about making yourself feel better, which is not the point." Cole picked up his glass, looked at it. "You're harder on people than you look." "I'm honest," Rose said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. "There is." He wrote the letter to Nora that night. Took 3 drafts. The first 2 were too long, full of explanations that Rose had already told him weren't the point. The third was half a page. He read it once, changed nothing, sealed it, brought it to the post office before the sun was fully up, walked back to the Silver Star. Rose was behind the bar. The breakfast crowd hadn't started yet. The room was still and golden, with early light, the way rooms are before the day fills them up. She set a cup on his table without being asked. He sat down. Window seat, left side. Clear line to both doors. He sat there and drank his coffee and looked out the window and thought about what Ray Colton had said the night before, the way he'd said it, standing in the Silver Star doorway with his sworn statement in his hand, looking at Rose before anyone else. "I can't give you what you lost," Ray had said, "but I can make sure every record says the true thing." That's what I can do. Repair wasn't drama. It wasn't a single moment. It was just the specific thing you could still do, done as honestly as you were capable of. Cole was working on being capable of more. 3 days later, a reply came from Denver. It was waiting on the Silver Star front desk when Cole came down for breakfast. His name on the envelope, in a handwriting he recognized. With a shock behind his sternum, the particular shock of seeing something you expected to be gone from your life, and finding it still real. He took the letter to his table, held it for a moment, opened it. He read it twice, sat very still, looked out the window at the morning street of Dusty Creek, going about its ordinary business. People moving, horses at the rail, smoke from the bakery 2 doors down. Rose came by with the coffee pot. She looked at him, at the letter in his hand. She poured his coffee and didn't ask. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. After a while, he said, "She says she's not ready to forgive. Says she's not asking herself to be." He stopped. "But she says she wants to meet the man I am now, not who I was. She makes no promises beyond that." Rose held the coffee pot. Looking at him, "She sounds," Rose said carefully, "like someone who has done a great deal of work on herself in the years you weren't around to complicate it." Cole, "She does. That's a good thing." "I know. Don't be sad about it," Rose said. "Be grateful for it. She figured out how to be whole without you. That means whatever comes next, if anything comes next, she's coming to it from a strong place, not a broken one." Cole folded the letter. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," Rose said, and went back to the bar. He sat with the letter in his coat pocket and the coffee in his hand, and the morning light moving across the floor toward his table. And something in his chest that had been wound tight for a very long time loosened one more turn. Outside, a rider came in fast from the South Road, pulled up hard in front of the Silver Star. Cole watched him through the window, dismounted, looked both ways down the street, went straight to the door. Cole set his coffee down. Decker had come back, and he hadn't come back alone. Decker had 6 men with him. No badges, no pretense of anything official. They set up at the South Water Station before dark, and they didn't hide the fact that they were there. That was its own message. "We're not sneaking. We don't have to." Cole watched them from the livery roof for 20 minutes, counted the horses, counted the rifles. Then he came down and told Rose what he'd seen. She listened, didn't flinch. "Railroad money," she said. "Has to be," Cole said. "Prescott and Fitch are finished, but the deal isn't. Somebody in Tucson still wants that water access, and they hired the next available option. So it's not over. Not yet." Rose looked at the bar, at the room around her, the tables, the lamp on the wall, Frank's photograph. "Then we finish it," she said. "But first, the letter." Rose asked him to read it aloud. Nora's letter. Cole hadn't planned to share it, but when Rose asked, he understood why she was asking, not out of curiosity, but because she'd helped him write the one that prompted it, and she deserved to know if it had landed right. He read it at the kitchen table, just the two of them, coffee going warm between them. Nora had written, "I'm not ready to forgive, and I'm not asking myself to be ready. I've spent 7 years building a life that didn't include you, and I'm not ashamed of that. But I've also spent 7 years carrying your absence, like it was my fault somehow, like I could have been enough to make you stay. Your letter told me clearly that it wasn't about me. I think I already knew that, but hearing it said plainly, without excuses attached, mattered more than I expected it to. I want to meet the man you are now. That's all I'm offering. Don't make it more than it is." Cole folded it. Rose was quiet for a moment. "She's protecting herself," Rose said. "She should," Cole said. "Yes." Rose looked at the table. "She's not offering you forgiveness. She's offering you a chance. Those are different things. And she knows the difference." She looked up. "Don't confuse them." "I won't. And don't make her prove she doesn't need you," Rose said. "Just show up. That's the whole job." Cole put the letter back in his coat. "She sounds like someone who earned herself." She did, Rose said. Without you. That's not a wound, it's a fact. Let it be a fact. Silas spent that morning on the front step of the Silver Star. He didn't call a meeting, didn't send word. He just sat there in the morning cold, with his hat in his lap, and talked to people as they passed, one at a time. Each person who slowed down got the same thing what he saw at Crooked Creek, stated plainly, without drama or self-pity, what he'd done with it, what he hadn't done. Cole watched from across the street for a while. The storekeeper stopped and stood with Silas for 20 minutes. A rancher from the East property took his hat off while Silas talked. An older woman held Silas's hand when he finished and walked away without saying a word. By afternoon 3, more people had come into the Silver Star and told Rose things they'd seen and not reported. Small things, big things, things they'd each thought they were alone in knowing. They weren't alone. They'd just never had somewhere to put it before. Ray Colton came at dusk, not in uniform. That was intentional. He came as himself, not as the badge, because what he was bringing was personal before it was official. He sat across from Rose at the window table, placed a folder in front of her. His corrected account of the Calloway investigation, not just the amended report, but everything. A full written record of every instruction Prescott had given him, every report he'd filed wrong, every time he'd looked the other way, and documented that he'd looked the other way, and why. I can't give you Frank back, he said. I know that. I'm not here to ask for anything. He looked at the folder. What I can do is make sure every record that touches your husband's name says the true thing. That's in there. All of it. Rose looked at the folder. She didn't open it right away. She sat with it the way you sit with something heavy before you decide where to put it down. Why me first? She asked. Before the federal office. Because he was your husband, Ray said. Because you've been carrying part of my weight for 16 months, and you didn't even know it. You deserved it first. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Ray. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Something more honest than both. What made you decide? Cole asked from the bar. Ray looked at his hands. I looked at my kids, he said. I thought about what they were going to know about who their father was, and I understood that I still had a hand in that. Not much of one, but some. He stood up. Some is enough to work with. He left. The room was quiet. Cole looked at Rose. She was still holding the folder, both hands around it, like it had weight. You all right? He asked. No, she said honestly, but I will be. That was enough. Later. Cole found Tommy and Alma in the back of the kitchen. Alma was teaching Tommy Navajo Star, names the constellation system her grandmother had taught her, which organized the sky differently than any map in any school book. Tommy was writing everything down in a small notebook, left page, Navajo names, and the stories attached to them. Right page, the English translations and the scientific catalog names. Cole stood in the doorway and looked at the notebook. Two maps of the same sky, Tommy said, without looking up. Neither one complete without the other, Amma said. Cole looked at both of them, at the notebook, at the two pages side by side. He didn't say anything. Some things didn't need adding to. The Silver Star was quiet when Cole came back inside. The last customers had gone. Silas was asleep at his piano bench, head on his folded arms, breathing slow and deep, the sleep of a man who has finally put something down. Rose was at the bar. She looked up when Cole came in. She didn't say anything. She came around from behind the bar and sat down at his table, the window table, the one he'd been claiming since the first night. She sat across from him. You didn't go, she said. No, Decker out there, and 6 men, and you didn't go. No. She folded her hands on the table. Cole looked at the lamp on the wall, at the room, at her. Because for 4 years, I've been trying to be nothing, he said. Small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough that eventually the thing I was running from would stop following me. He paused. Didn't work. The thing I was running from was inside me. You can't outlast that. So why stay here? Because I walked into a saloon that had its lamp still burning at 9 at night, and a woman brought me coffee without asking me to explain myself and something. Inside me, something I'd been trying to put out for 4 years started pointing at it. He looked at her like a compass finding north. Rose was quiet. I don't need you, she said. I know. I want to be clear about that. You've been clear from the beginning. Good. She unfolded her hands. Because there's a difference between needing someone and choosing someone. Between filling a hole and making a choice. She looked at him steadily. You've earned the wanting. That's not a small thing. I'm saying it plainly because you deserve plainness. I'll stay, Cole said, and mean it tomorrow and the day after. Every morning, Rose said. Not just the easy ones. Every morning, he said. That's the whole job. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside, the night was quiet. It didn't stay quiet long. Some things don't disappear just because their source has been removed. Money moves faster than justice. Always has. And money with a railroad contract attached to it will find another pair of hands faster than a federal warrant can process. Decker had 7 men now. Cole counted again at dawn from the livery roof. They weren't hiding anymore. Cole called the meeting at noon. He didn't make a speech. He stood in the middle of the Silver Star and said what was true. 7 men at the South Water Station. No badges. No legal standing. They're here because someone in Tucson still wants this property. And they've calculated that, with Prescott and Fitch gone, nobody in this town will stop them. He looked around the room. They might be right. Or they might have made a mistake about what this town actually is. A rancher from the East property. What are you asking? I'm asking what kind of town you want to live in after tonight, Cole said. Not what kind you want someone else to build for you. What kind you're willing to be. Silence, then Silas said, from the back. I was quiet for 16 months while Rose stood alone. I'm not standing aside tonight. The storekeeper stood up. Frank bought supplies from me for 5 years. I should have stood for him while he was alive. I'm standing now, one by one. Not everyone, 6 men left without a word. Cole noted each of them and didn't chase them. You can't make someone brave. You can only make it possible. The ones who stayed were enough. Cole asked each person what they could do, not what they were willing to try, what they actually knew how to do. Amma. My family has watched every approach to this valley for 60 years. I know 3 people who can cover the trailheads before dark. Ray Colton, in uniform. I'm still the acting deputy until a replacement is sworn. That authority is real, and I'll use it on record tonight. Tommy. There's a route behind the South Water Station. Comes up from the canyon floor below. Nobody from outside this valley knows it. Cole looked at him. Can you get there unseen? Tommy looked back with the patient expression of someone answering a question aimed slightly lower than his actual capability. I've been getting places without being seen my whole life. Yes, Amma said. The people a system makes invisible aren't made powerless by that invisibility. Sometimes the opposite. She said it plainly. To the room. Remember that tonight. They came after midnight. Fast and confident, the approach of men who have been told a town is empty of resistance. They weren't wrong about most of it. They were wrong about the part that mattered. The fight was not clean. It was not brief. Cole took a bullet through the left shoulder, 40 minutes in. It knocked him sideways against the wall of the Silver Star and dropped him to one knee. He stayed on one knee, couldn't get further up immediately, and kept directing from there, voice steady, until Ray moved into position. The pain was real. He didn't pretend otherwise, but he stayed in it. The decisive moment came when Decker broke for the livery, running for the horses, his own escape, and his last available threat in one move. Tommy was already there. He'd rigged the approach to the stable door with rope work. In the dark, not a weapon, not designed to harm. A controlled trip. The kind of technique you develop working horses. Reading movement. knowing exactly where a body in motion will commit its weight. Decker hit the ground at full speed. Tommy stepped out of the shadow and had Decker's wrists roped before the man finished understanding what had happened to him. Cole saw it from 20 feet away. Ray Colton's hand pressed to his shoulder wound. "I told you," Cole said. Tommy looked over. "Yeah," he said. "You did after." The South Road was quiet. 3 of Decker's men had run. 4 were secured. Ray Colton's authority making it official and recorded. Decker sat against the livery wall with his hands behind him and said nothing. Cole sat on the Silver Star porch, shouldered, dressed, and wrapped. Arm in a sling Amma had made from a flour sack, with the efficiency of someone who had treated injuries before and would again. Rose sat beside him. "You got shot," she said. "Yes." "Is this a regular occurrence?" "Less than it used to be." "That is not the reassurance you think it is." Cole looked at the street, at the people who had stayed. A few were still there, talking quietly, the particular loose relief of people who made it through something together. "I've been shot at for the wrong reasons before," he said. "This is the first time it was for the right ones." Rose put her head briefly on his uninjured shoulder, just briefly. Then she straightened. "Don't make a habit of it. I'll do my best." Inside, Silas was playing piano. Someone began singing along off-key, quiet, real. Then another voice joined. Then another. None of them were good. All of them were present. That was the whole difference. Holt came back in the morning. Federal charges confirmed. Prescott and Fitch would face trial. The Amma family land case formally opened. Federal examiner assigned. 60-day timeline in writing. And Dusty Creek needed a new sheriff. Everyone at the table looked at Ray Colton. Ray looked at the table. Then he picked up the badge and held it. "I'll take it," he said, "on one condition, that this room holds me to what I say next." Everyone waited. "Every morning, I'm going to ask myself one question," Ray said. "Who am I actually serving today?" And the answer has to be every person in this county. Every single one. Or the badge goes in the box. He looked around the room at Rose, at Amma, at Tommy. "I'm saying that out loud so you can hold me to it. Please do. I need you to." "Amma," from across the room. "I will write that down also." Ray, "Good." November came in clear and cold and final. The cottonwoods along the creek road went gold, and the wind took them apart slow and unhurried, the way November takes things apart. Out here, without apology, without drama. Just the season doing what seasons do. Cole was at his table when the stage arrived. He knew it was the Denver stage by the sound of it. He'd been listening for it for 3 days. He went outside. Nora Hardin stepped down from the stage and looked across the street at her father, and Cole looked back at her and understood immediately she had his eyes. Exactly the same quality of seeing before speaking, the same pause before committing. Her jaw was set the way his was set. They looked at each other across 7 years and the width of a dusty street, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Nora, "You look older." Cole, "You look like your mother." "I'll take that," she said. She crossed to him, and they held each other. Not long, not fragile. The embrace of 2 people who are both certain they are real and uncertain what comes next. "Cole, I'm not asking you to forgive anything today." "Nora, I know. I got your letter. I meant every word." "I know that too," she said. "That's why I'm here." She pulled back, looked past him. "Now, I have something to tell you." A pause. "I've been here since Tuesday." Cole went still. "That's 3 days ago." "Yes. I didn't. Tommy met me at the depot," Nora said. "He showed me the school." Cole went around the side of the Silver Star and looked through the livery stable door. 11 children, hay bales and feed sacks arranged in rows. A proper slate board mounted to the wall. Tommy and 2 others had hauled it from the hardware store. Nora stood at the front of it mid-lesson. She stopped when she saw Cole. The children didn't stop. They kept their eyes on the board because the teacher hadn't told them to stop. 7 different families represented in that room. Navajo, Mexican, Anglo, sitting mixed together on the same feed sacks without apparent awareness that anyone had ever suggested this was unusual. Amma sat against the back wall with her own small slate, learning to read at 50 years old, not lowering her eyes when Cole looked at her. Nora, class, this is my father. Cole, hello. The children, uneven and earnest. Hello, Tommy. From the back row, met Cole's eyes and nodded once. Cole nodded back. Afterward, outside, Nora said, every child in that room has the same right to an education, regardless of where their family came from or what language they speak at home. That's not a philosophy, it's the law, even when practice falls short of it. She looked at Cole directly. When law and practice are different, you close the gap with practice. You don't wait for permission. Cole looked at his daughter. You're going to stay. I'm going to stay, she said. Not for you. That matters not for you. But you're here, and that matters too. I know the difference, Cole said. Good, she said. Then we'll be fine. Nora and Rose had dinner together that first evening. Cole watched Nora watch Rose, the careful observation of a young woman applying a rigorous standard. Later, when Cole was helping Silas move a table, Nora said to Rose, you don't need him. No, Rose said, but you want him here. Yes. Why? Rose looked at the young woman and answered plainly, because the question was plain and deserved plainness. Because he showed up without an agenda, told the truth about what he'd done wrong, and did the work of repair without asking to be forgiven for it. And because when he looks at me, he sees a person, not a situation. Nora was quiet. He wasn't that man when I knew him. I know. Do people actually change? I think they can, Rose said. It costs more than they expect and takes longer than they want. But yes, she looked at Nora steadily. You want to know how to tell if it's real? Yes. Watch what they do when nobody's watching, Rose said. Character isn't the big moments. It's the small repeated ones that nobody records. Nora thought about that. What does he do when nobody's watching? He thanks Tommy Wren by name every morning. Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then, okay, she said. That was all, but it was enough. Ray Colton received his badge the next afternoon. Holt administered it simply, in the Silver Star, with whoever happened to be there. Ray spoke for less than 2 minutes. I was a bad deputy. I'm not going to explain that away because the people in this room know the history. He looked around at Rose, at Amma, at Tommy, at the ranchers who'd stayed. Every morning, I'm going to ask myself who I'm actually serving. And the answer has to be everyone in this county. Every single person. I'm saying it out loud so you can hold me to it. Amma was not at the edge of the room. She was in the center of it. Backstep of the Silver Star. Late evening, the November sky above Dusty Creek was the clearest sky Cole had ever sat under stars, close enough to seem like objects in the same room, only farther. Rose sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Cole said, I've been trying to figure out the right thing to say. You don't have to say the right thing. I know. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at the sky. I spent 4 years trying to become nothing. I thought if I was small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, eventually the damage I'd done would stop following me. He stopped. What I didn't understand was that you can't repair what you've broken by making yourself disappear. You repair it by doing something specific and real for the person or place that needs it. And then I walked into a saloon with its lamp still on at 9 o'clock, and a woman brought me coffee without asking me to explain myself. He looked at her, and something I'd been trying to put out for 4 years. Started pointing at it. Rose, I left the lamp on for late travelers. I know, it still found me. She put her hand over his. I'm tired, Rose said. Not weak. Tired. There's a difference. I've been carrying everything alone for a long time, and I've done it well, and I'll keep doing it well. She looked at him. But I would like to carry it with someone, not because I can't do it alone, because I've decided I deserve to have someone. She paused. You've shown me, not told me. Shown me that you're someone I trust with the parts of myself I stopped letting anyone see after Frank died. I'm honored by that, Cole said. You should be. She leaned her shoulder into his, not performing anything, just herself, fully present, tired and real and whole. Stay, she said, and mean it tomorrow. Every morning, Cole said. That's the whole job. That's the whole job, she agreed. 6 weeks later, on a cold, bright Tuesday, the schoolhouse. A real one hardware store's back room with rough-cut benches and the slate board from the livery. Nora at the front. 14 children. 2 columns on the board, English on the left, Navajo on the right. Same word, same meaning. 2 expressions of one truth. Tommy wasn't in the children's section. He stood beside Nora, the assistant teacher. He was 16, and he didn't find this remarkable, which was exactly right. Amma in the back row with her notebook, learning to read at 50, in a room full of children, a fraction of her age, not lowering her eyes when anyone looked at her. The right to learn has no age and no prerequisite of origin. Ray Colton's office. Morning, door open. First person through it, a Mexican rancher with a boundary complaint. Ray stood up when the man came in. The rancher stopped. He had not been expecting to be stood up for. Dignity in small daily moments is not formality. It is the practice of equal human worth. The Silver Star. Noon, Silas playing piano. A woman at a table singing along, not performing. Just singing because the song was in her and wanted out. 3 people playing cards and laughing about something that had nothing to do with fear. A community that is no longer afraid makes a different sound than one that is. Behind the bar. Morning, Cole pouring coffee. Carefully, with the focused attention of someone learning a new skill in a place he intends to know well. Rose in the kitchen doorway. You still pour it too fast. Cole, I'm working on it. Rose, you have time. She went back into the kitchen. Cole looked at the cup. At the window, at his table, same table. Same seat, same clear line to both doors. He sat down in it. He didn't need the line to the door anymore. Old habits take time to let go. He was patient with himself about it. That was new. Dusty Creek was not where Cole Hardin was headed. It was simply where the running stopped. And where, for the first time in longer than he deserved, something new and ordinary and honest began. And he was present enough, finally, to let it.
This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work. As we come to the end of this story, we're left with something far more valuable than a tale of the Old West. Beyond the dusty trails, the lonely ranches, and the hardships these characters faced, there is a timeless lesson about courage, forgiveness, and the strength of the human spirit. Life in the frontier was never easy. Every sunrise brought uncertainty, and every decision carried consequences. Yet the people who survived were not always the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who refused to let bitterness control their hearts. They learned that true strength is not found in revenge, pride, or stubbornness, but in the ability to rise after being hurt and to keep moving forward when the world seems determined to knock them down. This story reminds us that every person carries unseen burdens. Sometimes those who appear tough on the outside are fighting battles no one else can see. The choices we make in moments of pain often shape the rest of our lives. A single act of kindness can heal wounds that years of anger never could. A moment of understanding can bridge divides that seem impossible to cross. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that redemption is always possible. No matter how many mistakes have been made, no matter how far someone has wandered from the right path, there is always an opportunity to choose differently. The past may explain who we are, but it does not have to define who we become. The future belongs to those willing to learn, grow, and make peace with themselves. The story also teaches us the importance of family, loyalty, and community. Out on the frontier, no one survived alone for long. People depended on one another, and trust was often more valuable than gold. In today's world, that lesson remains just as important. Our relationships, our friendships, and the people who stand beside us during difficult times are the true treasures of life. Perhaps most importantly, this tale reminds us that justice and compassion must walk hand in hand. Seeking what is right is important, but so is remembering our shared humanity. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is show mercy when anger would be easier. Sometimes the great victory is not defeating an enemy, but overcoming the darkness within ourselves. As the sun sets over the open plains and the echoes of this story fade into the distance, we are reminded that every ending is also a new beginning. The challenges we face, the losses we endure, and the choices we make all become part of the legacy we leave behind. May this story inspire us to face our own journeys with courage, to treat others with compassion, and to never lose faith in the possibility of a better tomorrow. Thank you for spending this time on the trail with us. Until the next story, may your path be steady, your heart remain strong, and may you always find hope beyond the horizon.